Hello and welcome to another episode of Fundy Tidings. I'm your host, Jay Remer, and today with me I have Les Burridge, who is a former scientist at the St. Andrews Biological Station. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And today we're going to talk about toxicology, which is a subject near and dear to your heart, and it's something that the DFO has decided to eliminate as a department, I understand, and it may have some far-reaching consequences, which we'll explore today. What exactly is toxicology, Les?
Toxicology, simply put, is a science in which we try to determine the effects of chemicals on living organisms. Ecotoxicology, which is the work that I was involved with at the biological station, is an environmental science, and we're trying to look at the potential effects of chemicals that can get into the marine environment and how they might affect organisms that live there and depend on that environment to get by.
So basically, if you've got a problem that you're trying to solve and it's going to require chemical intervention, that chemical intervention isn't going to be necessarily solely focused on, I mean, it may be focused on the problem, but it will have side effects on other things, and that's what you are sort of studying?
I guess so, yeah.
To a degree?
There are some chemicals that go into the environment and the marine environment intentionally. There are others that get there, let's say, from runoff from agricultural activities, things like pesticides or herbicides and forest spray, aquaculture. There are different ways that chemicals can get into the environment, and we work on organisms or animals that we call non-target organisms, and they're the environmental equivalent of an innocent bystander. You aren't trying to expose those chemicals to those organisms, but it's likely that it can happen, or it's at least the potential that it could happen. Mm-hmm. So what we studied was, okay, if product A get into the water, what effect would it have on, let's say, a salmon or a lobster?
Right. And this study, this type of study, how long has this been going on?
It's been going on at the station in various forms, probably for 60 or 70 years, maybe longer. It has been a sort of a formal project. I worked at the station for over 30 years, and it was a formal environmental sciences project for that period of time. It goes back to a time when DDT was used as a pesticide throughout North America, and people started wondering what effect that particular pesticide might have on fish as well as birds and humans, for that matter. And one of the sort of the wake-up call for environmentalists was Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, and interestingly, there is a reference in her book to work that was done at the biological station back in the 50s.
Wow.
So it's been going on for quite some time. I'd like to say that it's an interdisciplinary science. It depends on biology, chemistry, physics, and the individuals aren't experts in all those fields. So it requires collaboration, and we're very lucky at the station to have the right people there over those years.
Right. Well, before we get actually into why this decision may have been made, maybe I think that our viewers would be interested in hearing some of the specific projects that may have affected their own lives that you've been studying over these 60 or 70 years.
Sure. I can speak of things that I know that were happening from the late 70s onward. And initially, when I first started working here, we were working on the effects of pesticides that were used to treat the forests in New Brunswick against infestations of budworm.
Oh, I remember that, yes.
So you could have a product, just because it was being sprayed from the air, it was, although they had setbacks, but it was probable that chemicals could get into the water. Well, one of the first things that I worked on here was a product that we found could kill salmon quite quickly, and so as a result of that, that product was no longer used to spray the forests of New Brunswick, or that formulation. Other things that we've been involved in is working on contamination with metals from mining and smelting operations in northern New Brunswick, in which an area was closed down to the lobster fishery for, well, the Beldoon Harbor is still closed to the lobster fishery. We were actively involved in that. We've been involved with chemicals used in aquaculture for pretty close to 20 years now. We've been have done a lot of work with oil and gas transport and potential effects of oil in water and chemical oil dispersants. Even things like how red tides or other algal blooms can affect fish. We've done some work on that. And municipal wastewaters. There are things that are coming out of sewage treatment facilities that may or may not have an effect on fish.
Yeah. So that's why the interdisciplinary aspect of it is so critical, because once you have determined that chemical A is too toxic really to be used, then they have to go back to the drawing board and come up with chemical B.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. That's the way it works. Also, when we're doing our work in the lab, we're putting the chemical in water and then putting the animals in and trying to see whether, whether it kills it. Does it live or die? But you can also have effects on fish and lobster or shrimp or whatever, that maybe it doesn't grow as well. Maybe it doesn't thrive, if you will. Maybe it doesn't molt. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it affects its biochemistry so that it doesn't fare as well in the wild as maybe it could. So you have to know whether the chemical is really what's causing the problem when you do that in a lab setting. You also have to be able to measure those biochemicals in the animal, or the chemical in the animal. It's like anything. It gets complicated very, very quickly. Well,
it sounds complicated, but it also sounds incredibly important. And so my question, coming from a non-science, I remember when I was in school, in college, they had a course called chemistry for non-science majors, and that's as close as I got to science. So I come at this from a more of a just a common sense point of view. So if you are no longer in business, so to speak, this kind of information sharing is still vitally important. And so how is that going to happen, or do they just say, well, it's really not important? I mean, am I missing the boat here?
You know, I sure can't speak for the government, but they've dropped the program toxicology and contaminants across the country. That includes about 55 individuals, and so I don't know who picks it up right now. The government's line was that they would transfer this to universities and to private labs. And the university people that I know, and I've heard a number of them who I don't know from across the country, stand up and say universities are not really equipped to do the type of work that the government was doing. They operate with graduate students and 2- and 3-year cycles for master's degrees, or longer for PhDs. And once they start a program, they aren't easily taken off point, where certainly our lab, in probably 10 cases that I can think of in the past, where we were told, okay, you can't do that right now. This has happened, and we have to look after it. And that ranges anywhere from a few dead lobsters in the fish market here in town 20 years ago to 80,000 pounds of dead lobsters in Back Bay, to a product called domoic acid, which was found in mussels from PEI and killed several people in Montreal. And we were involved in all of those types of things, and we were told, quite frankly, that I don't care what you're doing right now, this is what's important. And that will not work in a university system. Unlikely to work in a commercial lab system either, because they are set up for throughput of samples. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it raises a couple of points. One, in my mind, because I think the direct effect that it could have on people in the community, because this show is about our community, is that so for example, the response time that you would have referred to in these lobster issues and so forth would be impossible to deal with. So that could have a direct impact on businesses in the area,
I think
potentially.
So, yeah. Yeah, potentially.
And so I would think that for our listeners who are in the area who feel that that there could be some impact here, getting an explanation from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans would be something they might be interested in. And it would be really, it's not, I don't get involved in politics, but it would be, if I were in such an industry, I would be on the phone and say, well, what's the deal here? What's going on? Because it doesn't seem like it isn't making sense to me. Now it must make sense to somebody, or they wouldn't be doing this, but it doesn't make sense to me. And if it were to impact me, I think that we as citizens are entitled to explanations that we can understand and accept.
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I as an individual, and there were a number of very good scientists who were involved in this type of work long before I showed up here. We could come up with our own individual stories that have a local flavor, and I expect that every scientist across the country and technician or biologist or chemist who is involved in this, and they're all very professional people, could have their own list of stories. And yeah, there really is a local flavor. I wouldn't want to leave the impression that this is all about chasing problems. It's also, the research end of it is to look at some chemicals before they ever get a chance to go into the environment. Things that potentially could be used, scenarios that potentially could happen, and therefore be proactive and see that, okay, that compound doesn't look that bad, and it could be, maybe it could be tested someplace, or you know what, that's an absolute red light. That one's not going to be used in this area. So yeah, and the other thing that I don't know whether it comes into this conversation right now, but there's certainly all of us involved in this have got international and international collaborators. We aren't operating in isolation. We're working on projects that have a national scope, and in many cases international scope.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would think, I mean, it seems to me, it seems to me like that there could be some red flags raised as far as the, you know, even potentially food safety and stuff, which is obviously not a discussion that we can get into because that's not our area of expertise, is it?
Absolutely.
But I do think that it is something that we need to be more informed about. As not just, I mean, I can understand the facts that we're laying out today. The fact that the toxicology department has been dissolved is a fact. The ramifications of that could be anywhere from 0 to catastrophic. On a scale, and it probably, it's on that spectrum someplace, and having a clear understanding of that, I think is very important. And so, how do we go about being able to understand in our own minds, not being scientists, but being concerned citizens? Because some of the statistics, you know, of how toxic some of these chemicals are are shocking. And with the, I mean, if you go back to a few years ago when there was that terrible oil rig explosion down in the Gulf, well, that had, I mean, that woke everybody up. I mean, there were an awful lot of people who had never been alive when such a thing had happened, and were taken by complete surprise the ramifications of just what such a single incident could create. And with the potential for offshore drilling for natural gas off of Nova Scotia and for the importing of oil and all that, these sources of energy are critically important to us, but they're not going to be critically important to us if we're all dead as a result of you know, something, oops. And so how do we sort of size this up as regular citizens to kind of weigh the importance of this? Because obviously it's a shame that the biological station has had to lay off a certain number of people, but that's not really what the tragedy is. I mean, the tragedy potentially is far greater than that.
I agree with you, and the oil and gas is a good example. The pipeline trains are going off the rails. Pipelines are going. We want, the nation wants pipelines to come east but it's going to increase tanker traffic in the Bay of Fundy. The Deep Horizon rig that went down in the Gulf of Mexico, or the Exxon Valdez that went down 20 some odd years ago in Alaska. They're good examples of things that can happen. They don't happen often, but they don't have to happen.
They don't have to happen often.
And it was an area of study that we were involved in. Actually, one of the ones that we had to leave halfway through when the lab doors were shut. And it was a matter of finding out when oil hits water. We've all seen slicks and whatever, but there's also use of chemical dispersants, which breaks the oil up into smaller droplets. It doesn't land on the beach. It doesn't soak the gulls and the wildlife. But those chemical dispersants used, particularly in the volume they were used in the Gulf, could have consequences for organisms that live in that environment, whether that's the Gulf of Mexico or the Bay of Fundy. It's worthwhile research to be done, and we were involved in it. I came to a realization the other day that there was a not so public meeting held in Baton Rouge in 2010 in which discussing the use of oil dispersants while the Deep Horizon was still spewing oil, to talk about where this dispersed oil might go and potential effects. And there were 6 DFO scientists from the East Coast at that meeting, invited to that meeting because of our expertise. And as of today, about 3 years later, a little over 3 years later, none of those people work for DFO anymore. Right.
So that puts the country, so to speak, at a slight disadvantage at the table, because you're not at the table.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe from the country we don't care about the Gulf of Mexico, but principles, ordinarily principles in science and in our type of science, you know, we may be looking at a different organism than they have in the West Coast or they have in Europe, but generally the principles of potential effects.
Well, I mean, there's no question about that, but to my mind, you know, we may not care on one level about what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico because we don't live there, and we're likely, maybe we won't feel any effect. However, we are stewards of the planet, and this is not a Gulf of Mexico problem. This is or a Nova Scotia problem or a Bay of Fundy problem. This is an international problem because we are stewards of the planet, to my way of thinking. So I personally will be very interested to follow up with DFO, you know, and see what direction they're going. I know that, if you read, reports in the newspaper and all that, we all know how the media kind of, takes a particular view of certain things without it necessarily taking in the whole spectrum. But, for example, the one thing I remember, which gave me great, really relieved my mind tremendously, was, oh, well, don't you realize there are little organisms in the earth that eat oil? Yeah. And I thought, well, isn't that nice? Well, problem solved. Well, it's just not that simple, I don't think.
No.
And one of the things that you and I discussed in preparing for this show was the fragility, the incredible fragility of lobsters. And lobsters are a big industry here, and for ordinary people, a lobster is something that can grab a hold of you and bite you if it's not cooked. And you don't think of it as being so delicate and fragile. However, it is tremendously so, and can react to chemicals in such minute quantities that they're almost not measurable.
In many cases, they aren't measurable.
Yeah.
It's true. Now, before I say anything else, the lobster industry in southwest New Brunswick is doing very well. We have a major part of our research program in the last probably 15 years has been to look at compounds of aquaculture origin, whether they're things that are used normally as part of contaminants in feed, paints on nets to keep them from fouling up, or application of pesticides and drugs to get rid of sea lice, which is a major problem for the industry. Yeah. And the industry needs something to keep sea lice off their fish. But it's a very good example of a non-target organism, because once the salmon are treated to get rid of the small louse, those chemicals are released to the environment, and they're pesticides. They're built to kill, and some of them are very, very efficient at that. And so, as you say, they can animals can die or be affected, which is
they can have a big impact.
At very, very low concentrations, parts per billion and parts per trillion, very, very low quantities.
Well, I think I hope that the consequences of this are shared with people, and how the government is planning to what they're substituting for your department is important. Now, one of the things that happened also recently was the libraries have been shut down in the biological stations, and that's been on the news. And the visual that came to my mind, because we all know that these libraries have been closed and that all these incredible, decades of valuable research are basically being, they're being sort of warehoused, hopefully someplace, if they're not being completely tossed out. So the visual that I got was all these mad scientists rushing into these libraries without being stopped at all, which is fine, and rescuing these great volumes of research material so that they wouldn't have to go digging through the archives in some faraway place to get important information, to do their work. Mm-hmm. What have you found to be, how do you as a scientist see that act of closing the libraries down?
I think it's insane. I don't know any other way to put it. It has been in the news the last few nights with Health Canada. It's been in the national news. It's been in the Globe and Mail. The DFO minister has been putting out press releases. But science is an incremental process where you build on current knowledge and former knowledge, and libraries are essential to that. And to close a library in an institution like St. Andrews, it's not Ottawa. We can't go across the city and go to another library. in one sense, it's one of the luckier things about my being asked to leave is that I don't have to contend with it. Although
Right.
I like to stay involved but I won't have a library available to go look through. The scientists who are there and really need our support don't have it, and they're the ones that are they may be mad, but they certainly, to my knowledge, yes, they collected as many books as they could, and more power to them.
Absolutely, no question. Well, before we come to the end of our show, if there was sort of one takeaway that you really wanted to make sure that the viewers had, so that they could sort of understand this whole thing in a nutshell, how would that be?
He asked me this yesterday in our prep for this, and I thought about it, and I think I'd like people to realize that, at least in my opinion, there is a place for science for the public good. Science that wouldn't ordinarily be paid for by the industry that is operating, whether it's oil and gas or forest spray, whatever. And particularly with environmental sciences, which I was involved in and lucky to be so, there are things that are best done by governments to protect the public or to protect the public interest. Whether it's good or bad for the economy is important, but it's secondary. There is a spot for science by public servants for public good. Yeah. And I worked at the station beginning in the late 70s when we would have had a scientific staff of excess of 90 people. And I'm not privy to the hard numbers now, but my guess is that it's probably about half of that. And I worry that now that's taken 30 years to whittle it away, but I think there's a place for public science, and we should all support it.
Well, it sounds to me like there's what may be happening is that public safety may be taking a second seat to the economy, which of course is not the way all people think that things should be prioritized. But I would hope that for our viewers who have watched this show, that they would take the ball in their own hands and seek information from either their local lawmakers or from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans itself, to get so that they have a comfort level that is suitable.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I agreed to do this. Ecotoxicology clearly isn't something that people throw into a sentence every day. It's not that well known, and I wanted people to understand what we had here and what we did and what we had across the country. I'm not sure that I agree completely that public safety is at risk, because all of these products are registered and they go through a very detailed regulatory process. However, there are unknowns, and that's what our research was involved in, is trying to provide data so that those regulations either could be upheld or changed, or policies could be changed, or laws could be changed.
Yeah. Les, thank you very much for being on the show today. I really learned a lot, and I think our viewers have too. Thank you for watching our show today, and I look forward to having you watch another episode of Fundy Tidings soon.